Okay, let's unpack this. The name Spartacus, just hearing it, conjures up these incredibly powerful images, right?
Absolutely.
It's rebellion, it's the fight for freedom, this epic struggle against the might of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually try to dig into who he really was, the man behind the myth, and what his massive uprising was genuinely about, well, it turns out to be surprisingly difficult to pin down.
It absolutely is. Spartacus is a name that echoes through history, but the historical figure is frustratingly elusive.
Right.
Our mission in this deep dive is to take the sources you've provided, accounts primarily written long after the fact, and really work through the known facts, grapple with the historical ambiguities, and figure out why this figure has such a powerful, enduring legacy.
And that difficulty is really central to our understanding, isn't it? Because as you pointed out, our primary sources, guys like Plutarch and Appian, they are writing a century or even more after Spartacus was dead and buried.
Or maybe not buried, as we'll see.
True. But the point is, it was a long time after.
Exactly. There are no surviving contemporary accounts, let alone anything from eyewitnesses on the ground during the revolt.
Nothing at all.
No. And crucially, we have absolutely nothing from the perspective of the enslaved people who joined him. We're relying entirely on the victors, writing decades later, maybe trying to make sense of it, maybe even spin the events.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a huge puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Right. And the other half were drawn by the people who were, trying to catch the guy you're looking for.
Okay, so let's try to assemble the pieces we do have. What do the sources tell us about who this guy was before the revolt?
Well, they generally agree on his origin. He was a Thracian by birth.
Thracian, right.
Plutarch suggests he was from the Mede tribe, which would place him in the region of modern-day Bulgaria, sort of.
And his background before enslavement? I gather that's debated too.
Oh, yeah. Appian says he served with the Romans as a soldier before being taken captive.
Okay, so an auxiliary maybe?
Possibly. But then Flora says he was a Thracian mercenary who deserted, then got enslaved.
Different story.
Totally. And Plutarch even mentions his wife, a prophetess from his tribe, was enslaved alongside him. So the details vary, they even contradict each other.
But the common thread is clear. He ends up a captive, sold into Roman slavery.
Right. Which led him to Capua, specifically to the gladiatorial school run by Lentulus Batiatus.
Ah, the gladiator school. He was trained there as a heavyweight gladiator, wasn't he? Murmillo.
Yes, exactly. Known for fighting with a big rectangular shield and a short sword. Big guy, tough fighter.
And it was there, in 73 BC, that he became part of a plot among the gladiators.
They weren't just going to wait for their next fight in the arena. They decided they were getting out.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because it wasn't some massive, perfectly equipped military breakout, was it?
Not at all. The sources actually differ on the number who initially escaped, anywhere from fewer than 50 to perhaps up to 78. It wasn't a huge force to start.
So, pretty small group initially.
Yeah, and what stands out to me is their sheer resourcefulness at the start. They certainly didn't have swords and spears just lying around.
Right.
The sources describe them seizing kitchen utensils, spits, choppers, that kind of thing.
Kitchen knives, basically.
Yeah, and fighting their way out just to get hold of the actual gladiatorial weapons and armor they found nearby.
So they fought their way out, quickly defeated some local soldiers sent after them, and then started plundering the immediate area around Capua. And this is where their numbers really started to swell, right?
Yes, this is key. The sources specify they attracted large numbers of other enslaved people, but with a clear emphasis on rural slaves.
Rural slaves. Why is that distinction important?
Well, it raises an interesting question about the nature of the rebel army, doesn't it? Rural slaves people working on farms as herdsmen, shepherds, were typically, far more physically hardy.
Right. Used to tough conditions.
Yeah, exactly. Accustomed to tough outdoor conditions, basic subsistence. Probably more so than urban slaves, whose sources sometimes describe, well, less charitably, as maybe more accustomed to household life.
So recruiting rural slaves likely provided a more robust fighting force for a rebellion that would spend years on the march.
Seems likely, yes. A more suitable base for that kind of warfare.
Fascinating detail. And they quickly found a place to consolidate after those initial successes, a really strong defensive position up on Mount Vesuvius.
A very clever strategic move. Now, initially, Roman sources suggest the leadership was shared among Spartacus and two Gallic slaves, Crixus and Anomus.
Shared leadership?
Possibly. But we should be cautious here. Roman historians often projected their own ideas of hierarchy onto, well, barbarian groups. They might have simplified what could have been a more fluid or, decentralized leadership structure in a spontaneous uprising like this.
Good point. So the rebellion ignites on Vesuvius, they start building their forces, and Rome's first reaction was essentially a shrug.
Pretty much. Rome drastically underestimated them. They initially treated it like a policing problem.
Just some runaway slaves and gladiators.
Exactly. To be dealt with by local militias or praetors, not a major military concern at first.
And just to remind everyone, what exactly was a praetor in this context? Not a top general, right?
Right. A praetor was a high-ranking magistrate, a senior Roman official who could hold military command. But the forces they commanded in Italy, especially while the main legions were busy elsewhere.
Like in Spain or the East.
Precisely. Those forces were often less experienced levies or militias, not the seasoned professional armies Rome used in foreign wars.
Got it. So at Vesuvius, the Roman praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber tried to trap them. He set up a siege, blocking the single known path down the mountain.
Yeah, standard siege tactic. Starve him out.
But Spartacus showed his tactical brilliance here.
He absolutely did. Facing the siege, Spartacus used a truly audacious tactic. His men cut down vines growing on the slopes of Vesuvius.
Wild vines.
Yeah, wild vines, and used them to make ropes. They then climbed down the incredibly steep, unguarded side of the volcano, a path the Romans thought was completely impassable.
Wow. Down a cliff face, basically.
Essentially, yes. This allowed them to get behind the Roman camp and launch a total surprise attack that completely routed Glaber's militia. It was a stunning, unexpected victory.
And that success must have just poured fuel on the fire.
Oh, absolutely. They defeated a second Roman expedition shortly after, seized their weapons and armor, and their numbers just exploded.
How many are we talking now?
The estimates get really big here, perhaps around 70,000 rebels by this point.
70,000. That's an army.
It was a truly diverse force now. The sources list Celts, Gauls, those rural herdsmen and shepherds, farmers. And interestingly, even some Roman legion veterans from the earlier social war joined them.
Veterans.
Yeah.
That would bring invaluable military discipline and knowledge.
Huge advantage. So they spent the winter of 73-72 BC consolidating, training this massive diverse army, and expanding their reach. They started raiding towns and territories across southern Italy, places like Nola, Nuceria, Thorii, Metapontum.
So they weren't just sitting on Vesuvius anymore.
No, they were mobile. And the sheer geography and scale of these operations during that winter suggests they probably weren't operating as one single massive army all the time.
Makes sense. Hard to feed and manage that many people in one spot.
Exactly. It's far more probable they split into separate groups, campaigning and foraging, likely led by Spartacus and Crixus independently at times.
Okay, so by the spring of 72 BC, Rome couldn't ignore this anymore. This wasn't a police problem, it was a major war on Italian soil.
No question. The Senate finally dispatched 2 consular legions to deal with them. Proper armies this time.
Consular legions led by the consuls, the highest elected officials.
That's right. Rome was taking it seriously now, and initially one of those consular armies achieved a significant victory.
Against 2.
They defeated a large contingent of rebels, maybe around 30,000, who had separated from the main force. This group was led by Crixus, near Mount Garganus. Crixus himself was killed in that battle.
So a major leader is gone, and a big chunk of their force is defeated. Looked like Rome might have finally gotten the upper hand.
You'd think so, but then Spartacus himself faced the other consular legions and defeated them decisively. He turned the tables again.
Incredible.
Yeah. It's worth noting, though, that even the details of these battles against the consuls are described quite differently by Appian and Plutarch.
Right, those source discrepancies again.
Always there. But the outcome was clear. Spartacus remained a major undefeated threat.
Facing this escalating crisis, Rome turned to its wealthiest citizen, Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Crassus, ambitious, incredibly rich, and saw this as his chance for military glory. He hadn't had a major command like his rival Pompey yet.
So he jumps the chance. How many troops did he get?
He was given command of 8 legions, that's over 40,000 Roman soldiers, a significant professional force.
And he was known for his incredibly harsh discipline, wasn't he?
Oh, notoriously so. Tell us about that.
Well, he famously revived the ancient brutal punishment of decimation.
Decimation. What exactly did that involve?
If a unit performed poorly or showed cowardice, he would randomly select 1 out of every 10 soldiers in that unit and have them executed by their own comrades, executed by their friends. That's brutal.
It was. His goal was simple: Make his soldiers fear him more than they feared the rebels. Ensure absolute obedience through terror.
A terrifying motivation. So Crassus takes command, brings this huge disciplined force, and starts to gain the upper hand.
Eventually, yes. Through sheer force of numbers and that iron discipline. Now, for reasons that are still debated.
Ah, another mystery.
Right. Plutarch suggests Spartacus initially planned to march north to the Alps and maybe disperse his men home.
Which seems logical if they just wanted freedom.
It does, but it doesn't fully explain why he then turned south again after beating the consular armies. Regardless, the rebels moved south through Italy, with Crassus in relentless pursuit.
This chase led them down to the toe of Italy, right, near the Strait of Messina at Rhegium.
Exactly. And Crassus was able to use the geography brilliantly here. He built a massive line of fortifications, a huge ditch, and a wall right across the narrow isthmus.
Trapping them?
Effectively, yes. Trapping the rebels in the Bruttium Peninsula, cutting off their supplies. It was a major strategic move.
A strategic masterpiece by Crassus. So Spartacus is trapped. What does he do?
Facing this trap, Spartacus tried a bold, though ultimately unsuccessful, maneuver. According to Plutarch, he tried to cut a deal with Cilician pirates who were active in the area.
Pirates. What was the deal?
He offered them money, a substantial amount, apparently to transport him and about 2,000 of his men across the narrow strait to Sicily.
Sicily. Why Sicily?
The hope was likely to reignite the slave revolts that had happened there before. Sicily had a history of major slave uprisings. It could have opened a whole new front.
Makes sense. Did it work?
No. Plutarch says the pirates took the money and simply sailed away, abandoning the rebels. Double-crossed. Yeah. Other minor sources mention the rebels desperately trying to build rafts or even ships themselves, but Crassus's fortifications and patrols prevented any large-scale crossing. They were stuck.
So they were trapped. And Crassus was feeling the pressure, wasn't he? Because another major Roman general was on the way.
That's right. Pompey the Great. Returning with his legions from putting down a revolt in Spain.
Pompey.
Yeah.
Crassus's big rival.
Exactly. Pompey was ordered by the Senate to head south and assist Crassus, and Crassus was desperate to finish the war and claim the victory for himself before Pompey arrived and potentially stole his thunder.
Classic Roman general politics.
Always. So, with the net tightening, Spartacus reportedly tried one last diplomatic move.
He tried to negotiate.
He sent envoys to Crassus, attempting to negotiate some kind of truce or terms. But Crassus, confident of victory, probably wanting revenge for earlier defeats and the sheer indignity of the revolt,
He refused.
flatly refused. No terms.
So, left with no other option, Spartacus and his army had to break out of the siege lines.
They had to fight their way out. And they actually they forced their way through Crassus's fortifications in a night attack.
Impressive. But Crassus was right behind them.
Oh, yes. Crassus pursued them north towards Brundusium, perhaps where Spartacus hoped to find ships. But during this pursuit, discipline within the rebel army reportedly began to fray.
How so?
Sources suggest smaller groups started breaking off, maybe attempting their own escapes or independent actions. The army became less cohesive.
Falling apart under pressure.
Seems like it. Spartacus, facing this potential disintegration and Crassus closing in, had to turn his remaining main force to make a final, desperate stand.
And that final battle took place near the Scylla River, right?
Near the headwaters of the Scylla River, yes. Modern Scylla River.
And the outcome.
It was a brutal, decisive engagement. The Roman legions, under Crassus's unforgiving command, completely routed the rebels. The vast majority were killed on the battlefield.
And Spartacus himself.
Most accounts, like Plutarch's and Florus's, say he died fighting bravely. Plutarch gives this vivid image of him killing his horse before the battle, saying if he won, he'd have many horses. If he lost, he wouldn't need one. Then fighting his way through soldiers trying to reach Crassus himself before being cut down.
A warrior's death, according to them.
Yes. But intriguingly, Appian states that despite extensive searching, Spartacus's body was never actually found.
Never found. That just adds to the mystery of the man, doesn't it?
It really does. Did he fall unrecognized? Did his followers hide the body? We just don't know.
And the Roman response to the survivors was utterly horrific.
It was merciless, a calculated act of terror. To serve as a chilling warning and demonstration of Rome's absolute power, Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 captured survivors.
6,000.
6,000. They were crucified at intervals along the entire length of the Appian Way, the major road leading from Rome all the way back to Capua, where the revolt began.
This is over 100 miles.
Over 100 miles of crucified bodies lining the road. A public spectacle of Roman vengeance.
An absolutely brutal end to the rebellion. Which brings us back to that core historical puzzle we started with. After all this, what did Spartacus actually want? What was the goal?
It's the big question, isn't it? And the classical historians themselves couldn't seem to agree.
They were divided.
Yeah. Plutarch suggested his main goal was simply to escape Italy, march north into Cisalpine Gaul, maybe over the Alps, and allow his men to disperse and return to their homes in Gaul or Thrace.
Which sounds plausible for escaped slaves. Just get home.
It does. But as Plutarch himself admits, this doesn't fully explain why Spartacus turned south after having earlier defeated consular armies that were blocking his path north. Why turn back?
Good point. What did others think?
Appian and Florus, on the other hand, wrote that Spartacus originally intended to march on Rome itself, to actually attack the city.
March on Rome. That's audacious.
Hugely. Though Appian adds that he later abandoned this plan, perhaps realizing it was impossible. Which raises the question, was this ever a concrete rebel objective, or was it maybe primarily a Roman fear that got written into the history?
Hard to say. And what about just plunder?
Well, we also have that evidence from the winter raids, suggesting rebel groups were focused on plundering towns and getting supplies. It's entirely possible that different factions or groups within that massive, diverse rebel army had different goals.
So some wanted plunder, some wanted escape, some might have wanted something more revolutionary?
It's very possible. We're talking about tens of thousands of people from different backgrounds thrown together. They might not have had one single unified aim beyond immediate survival and fighting the Romans.
Okay, one of the biggest ideas that has shaped the modern image of Spartacus, certainly, is the idea that he was fighting to end slavery entirely in the Roman Republic.
Ah, yes, the great abolitionist hero.
You see him interpreted this way constantly. Voltaire called his war the only just war in history. It's a powerful image.
It's incredibly powerful, and it clearly connects to the symbol he became later on, but it's important to look carefully at what the classical sources actually say, or perhaps what they don't say.
And what's that?
There is no historical account from that period that confirms that the complete abolition of slavery across the Republic was a stated goal of Spartacus or the rebellion.
Not at all.
No. The sources suggest they freed certain types of slaves who were useful to their cause. Gladiators, farmers, herdsmen, the tough rural types.
The ones who could fight or support the army.
Exactly. But notably, they didn't seem to target or actively recruit urban slaves, the household slaves, who were a huge population in Rome and other cities. If the goal was universal abolition, you might expect a different approach.
Interesting distinction. So the historical man, his precise motives, even his final fate, they're all shrouded in ambiguity and debated by the very historians who are our only sources.
Pretty much sums it up. Lots of gaps, lots of contradictions.
But despite that, or maybe even because of that ambiguity, his legacy is incredibly powerful, isn't it? He became this potent symbol long after his death.
Absolutely. The symbol arguably became much bigger than the historical figure ever was. He was seized upon by revolutionaries and political thinkers across centuries.
Like Karl Marx.
Famously, Marx called him the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history and a real representative of the ancient proletariat. High praise for Marx.
You see his name directly invoked in actual political movements, right?
Definitely. Like the German Spartacus League, the Spartacus Bund, and the Spartacus Uprising in Berlin right after World War I, led by people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
And he's been explicitly linked to other major rebel figures, too.
Yes, like Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution against French colonial rule and slavery. He was often called the Black Spartacus.
So the name itself became shorthand for revolutionary struggle against oppression.
Exactly. And his impact just exploded into popular culture, reaching far beyond political movements or history texts.
You mean literature, films?
Oh, yeah. You find him in literature, most famously in Howard Fast's novel from the 1950s.
Which then led to the movie.
The huge, iconic 1960 film adaptation by Stanley Kubrick starring Kirk Douglas, I Am Spartacus, that scene alone cemented him in popular consciousness.
Absolutely iconic. And it doesn't stop there, does it?
Not at all. There have been television series like The Stars Show, which was quite different in tone.
Very different. Lots of blood and sand.
Indeed. But also theater, music, countless video games, board games. He's everywhere. He's even inspired geographical names like Spartacus Peak down in Antarctica.
Antarctica. Okay, that's dedication.
And of course, his name is absolutely everywhere in the world of sports, particularly in countries with a history tied to communist or socialist ideologies.
You mean like Spartak Moscow?
Spartak Moscow is the big one, but countless others. The Spartakiad was essentially the Soviet bloc's alternative Olympics for a long time. The name just resonated with that idea of popular strength and uprising.
It really does show how that symbol of resistance against oppression, that core idea of fighting the system, became so deeply ingrained and adaptable across totally different cultures and contexts.
It completely transcended the specific, uncertain historical details of the man and the revolt itself. The symbol took on a life of its own.
So we've taken this deep dive into the sources you shared, exploring the fragmented accounts of Spartacus's murky early life, the dramatic twists and turns of his brutal rebellion, and the different and often conflicting ideas about what he might have actually hoped to achieve.
And throughout, we've seen again and again that the challenge of knowing for sure is constant. Our understanding is filtered through these sources written decades, even centuries after the fact.
By the victors.
By the victors. And crucially, without any direct testimony from the rebels themselves, we don't have their voices.
Which really leaves you with this powerful thought to consider, doesn't it? Given that his body was never definitively found, his true objectives remain hotly debated even by the ancient historians who wrote about him, and our information is just so incomplete.
Yeah.
Does the symbol of Spartacus, this enduring, adaptable icon of resistance against oppression that has inspired countless movements and works of art across millennia, does that symbol ultimately matter more in history and culture than the precise, elusive details of the historical man himself?
That's a great question.
What does the enduring power of that symbol tell us about what people need to believe or perhaps need to remember about fighting back against seemingly overwhelming power?